Web 20 classrooms. So that's our panel for today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by all of them. To get us started with today's session, what will classrooms look like when we go back to school? Planning for the classrooms of the future. As schools work towards reopening their doors, in addition to logistical challenges of seating plans and meal timings and separating children and masks and so on and so forth, we also need to recalibrate for newer teaching and learning habits that have formed over the last few months, or that will also emerge and form as we go back to school and settle into what might be very, very uncertain times. What lessons should we take with us as we move forward? What are some of the learnings that we've had in the last few months? And are there any that we actually might want to leave behind as we step into these new classrooms? So in today's session, we will be talking about all of these challenges and much, much more, all of the learnings, all of the reflections and considerations for schools as we go forward. And I'd now like to open up to Dr. Shalini Advani and bring her on board and get us started for today's session, and learn from her how she and her school are preparing for the future of classrooms. So over to you, Dr. Advani.
Thank you very much, Pallavi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on the time zone you're in. Just give me a minute while I share my screen so that we can begin looking at. So amongst us panelists, we've divided up this theme, as Pallavi talked about, and I'm going to be looking predominantly first at systems issues, but really from the perspective of learning and from the perspective of what it is that students need. These are visuals which I think are pretty familiar to everybody. We're going back to classrooms with social distancing, 3 feet, 6 feet, depending on the requirements of that. They're going to be wholly new systems of coming in. These lamentable visuals which look almost like a child or anybody coming up having being held up with a gun. But of course, there are thermal guns or thermal scanners. There's going to be sterilization. We're going to need markers and cue markers. We know that children will not be able to use the same water fountains or common supplies. All of these things, I think there's a lot of information on, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Let's look at what is going to happen in terms of when the children are back. Us adults are going to have beautiful systems in place. It's a different thing about ensuring that those are followed up. We know, for instance, that very little children in the early years need to be picked up. They cry, they want to cuddle. What happens about that? Worldwide schools that have opened have reported significant challenges with teenage girls who, when they meet, want to hug each other and come up close. And these are the sorts of challenges that we're going to have in terms of implementation. It's very important to not make this into the responsibility of the adults who end up policing, but to really promote a social responsibility education program for children, that it's not just about them, but they have a responsibility to the older people in their homes, and they need to take care of that. Any administrative system has an emotional and a learning aspect. And it's very important for us to look at that when we look at administration. Now, all of these things are going to send out a message that we don't usually send out to children, which is that there is danger around. And there is a delicate balance that we have to maintain between the idea of being careful and having some healthy amount of fear, but combining that with an understanding that there is something that you can do about it, the social responsibility aspect. All of this is going to lead to stress. India has had one of the most severe lockdowns in the world. And in some senses, people are going to be coming out of caves. And we're almost unused to meeting in groups and crowds, and that's going to create its own psychological challenges. So schools need to think of what are their counseling programs, both with, of course, traditional counselors. But really, I think every teacher is going to have to take on a counseling role to be able to spot children who are in stress and to be able to manage that. I would advise every school to set up a school task force. And the task force would, of course, be made up of the head of school, the head of sections, the school doctor, the head of administration. It's important to have some parents in this and at regular intervals to have students as part of the school task force. And what is the role of this task force? They're going to have to go on interpreting government regulations, which may change from time to time. There will be emergency decisions that come up if one child in one grade comes down with COVID, and that is going to happen. How many people do you isolate? What is your decision-making process for that? We're going to have to review the functionality, the implementation of the systems that we have set up. Alongside that, more than ever before, we have to think of a partnership with parents. Parents are going to have a huge amount of anxiety. So it's important for us to go on communicating. Maybe you have a section on your website to look at newsletters and updates of what the school is doing, how we're managing the process. But that reassurance of parents really is a very important aspect. Moving now to the education aspect. We're not going to, for a very long time, have all our children back in school together. We are looking at 50% coming back at any given time or on any given day. And therefore, what we're looking at is a blended learning approach. And different schools are looking at different ways of managing their schedules. Maybe some grades, the top grades and the early years, have been identified as those that need the most direct contact with teachers, that could be, or different grades on different days, or maybe parts of a grade, so that 50% of a grade come in on a particular day. Whatever it is, we are going to have to develop and be able to publicize our schedules. This is really an opportunity for relooking at some of our education imperatives about looking at personalizing learning opportunities for children. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, as will the other panelists. There is the whole aspect of equity. Not every child has equal bandwidth. They have a variety of devices. Maybe there is one device in the family, which is also being used by parents. There is the question of students with special education needs and how we need to take that forward. Not every family gives the same amount of support when children are at home in asynchronous learning. So there is a differentiation in the support children get. Schools also need to plan for if parents choose not to send their child back because they're afraid. One approach could be to say, well, this is the day your child is due to come back. If you're not sending them back, that is your problem. I don't believe that that is the right approach. Schools have to find ways of beaming, maybe on Zoom, maybe on Microsoft Teams, what is happening in the class. That child should be able to join the class as well. But that's a policy decision that schools have to take. Teacher planning is going to become extremely complex because teachers will be planning for maybe 50% coming in class and therefore do class planning, and also 50% for asynchronous work. What would be a good idea is for a teacher to put out a 1 week or ideally even a 2 week plan in detail for the different groups, so that those children who are working independently know the direction of their learning, know what they're expected to do, by when they're to hand it in. With the younger children, certainly share that with parents. But a flipped classroom approach, even when children come in to class, is important, so that the teacher is really spending time discussing and sorting out problems with children, not constantly only loading content onto them. We need to look at a different approach. And for those who are working from home, we need to have interesting ways of asynchronous learning, encouraging groups and collaborations, not so much worksheets, but group work, discussions, working on Google Slides or Google Doc, collaboratively together. Assessment. In India, we have a huge emphasis a lot of the time on assessment of learning. This is a wonderful time to move more strongly to assessment for learning. Let's not spend the limited time that the children are coming into class for them to sit down and do pen and paper tests where the teacher is basically policing them. We need to spend time on finding different ways of assessing, maybe with presentations, using flipped grid where students can talk, doing a quick check with Kahoot. But let's look at rethinking assessment. What are the sort of challenges we're going to expect? One is certainly going to be the fractured routines. We're used to, and children are used to, the fact that they wake up, they put on their school uniform and get ready and come to school and then learn. Now that is indeed going to happen on some days. And then the other day, a child might wake up late, whether they will settle down to working in a routine. They will find their own pacing of working, maybe not in the progress that the teacher had expected. And again, I would say this is an opportunity to think about the power of student agency and be able to harness that. There has been a lot of research which finds that students do very well if they're able to work at their own pace. And so we need to look at that as a strength rather than a challenge. There are also different skills that we don't always teach in school, certain competencies that children need to be taught. Of course, a comfort with the tools if they're working asynchronously. But in addition to that, developing motivation, developing time management, dealing with failure and who to go to for help, resilience. These are competencies that we need to actively teach children now. And finally, for teachers, what are teachers going to need? A lot of support. Of course, support with what is the best platform, what are the best apps, if you're looking at giving feedback, if you're looking at assessment, if you're looking at group work, what are the different types of apps and approaches that you should be using? Look at ways of giving feedback. One of the things with this asynchronous learning is children will learn better if they have a constant connect with the teacher, which comes with feedback. Now, a teacher who's got 40 children in a class and teaching multiple classrooms has got to find quicker ways of giving effective, efficient feedback. Maybe just a voice note taped on OneNote or QuickTime, or a one-liner email. And school policies need to support this, need to enable and encourage this, because it has a powerful impact on learning. Teachers need additional planning time. As I'd said, it's going to be a much more complex process. One suggestion I could give is that have a longer school day for teachers than for students. So if your normal school day is till 3:30, stop school day for students at 2 o'clock and give time till 3:30, an hour and a half to teachers to be able to plan, to collaborate, and to work forward. And finally, online communication strategies. What we've done with teachers is we've put them into the position of being television commentators or anchors. And teachers have been heroes. They've managed this beautifully. What they really need to do is to have some help in what are the best ways of communicating. How do you communicate and connect with a child online? Make sure that your voice is audible, that you're visible, the lighting works well. Some of those skills and strategies would really help teachers in their training. So I'm going to stop with that now and hand back to Pallavi.
Thank you so much for that extremely informative presentation, Dr. Advani. Some wonderful ideas coming in there, and I love the focus on blended learning, preparing for that, and also for social and emotional support that we must provide to students at this time, because there's been a long gap of social disconnect. And kids have responded to that in very many different ways, and helping them readjust when they come back to school is going to be extremely crucial. So thank you so much for some of those extremely useful suggestions and ways forward. A couple of questions that came in from the audience, and I'd like to open these out to everybody on the panel, and not just Dr. Advani, but one being, so we've talked about a lot of the safety norms for students. Dr. Advani, what would be some safety norms that you might suggest that we put in place for teachers as well?
Yes. So for teachers, this is a very important policy for the school to look at. What are we going to do with teachers who have comorbidities or who are in a dangerous age group? Are we going to allow them to teach from home? These are school policy issues, but it's very important for schools to come to terms with that. In fact, teachers are more vulnerable than children, and we need to take account of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Also opening this up to other panelists, if Craig, if you'd like to chip in on what are some of the safety norms that are being followed at your school that are there particularly for the kind of teachers who might be at risk?
Well, I agree with Dr. Advani that you just want to ensure that if the opportunity presents itself for remote teaching, you would want to allow for that. And additionally, you may want to have like a small cohort of teachers who have the ability to teach remotely and provide a staff member who can be on campus to provide additional supplementary support for those students who really need it.
Pallavi, may I just add a couple of things?
Please, go right ahead, Kirsten.
Okay, hi. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I think the first thing we've been talking about is actually comprehensive training. So it's on-site training before school opens in terms of the health and safety measures that everybody needs to take. And so I think it's not just the protocols that we have, it's actually training people in how to use them, in how to move around, in actually what this amount of distance means. And we're also looking at developing, planning areas in the school, because the teachers will not be planning in their classrooms, the classrooms will be fully used. But then we're putting in place protocols for how those are used, how those are cleaning, and making sure that everybody in the school community, whether it's teachers, whether it's parents, whether it's students, are actually aware of all the protocols, particularly to do with health and safety, movement, cleanliness, these kind of things. Because then you're taking the risk down. And then you can, once you've taken the risk down, you can then look at who is your most at-risk groups within that risk that you've lowered to your maximum lower potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. One other peculiar problem that some of the schools might face as we reopen is especially schools that have international staff, which had gone back when the lockdowns were put into place, or even staff who have gone back home to various other cities in their respective countries. So there might be schools who will face this challenge of working with a reduced teacher task force. What sort of things would you recommend for schools like that? Because I know, Dr. Advani, you recommended that we put in more planning time for teachers. So how would we ensure that all of those teachers who are perhaps in various other different time zones and are not in school in person, how do we sort of keep them in the loop and also look after their mental health and well-being?
Well, as you can see in this panel, we have people here in different time zones. And I know that happened a lot in China, where a lot of teachers had gone home because it was time for Chinese New Year when the lockdown happened. And then with the reopening, they were all teaching at all odd hours for themselves, teaching remotely. I think teachers have shown a fantastic commitment to be able to work around this system and deliver learning to students. And I think that is what would happen.
Absolutely.
I think that another thing is the schools that are really trying to think flexibly about who they have and how they deploy them, and maybe looking at some roles have to shift because of the, because of what's going on. And with the exception of the very youngest children, I know that some schools are having success with teachers actually zooming into the classroom from outside. They have to make sure that there's always a learning aid in there, and there has to be communication between the teacher and the learning aid about the learning setup and the learning that's going on. So it's complex, it's not ideal, but there are some ways around it. It is definitely a challenge. We have to think as flexibly as we can, and the best thing to do is say, who do we have and how can we best deploy them to meet the needs of the students, and what other priorities that we might have had on our development plan that we might have to press pause on right now because we don't have that luxury. And that might involve some difficult conversations with people on the ground.
And can I just add, can I just add one thing here? And as Dr. Advani said, open lines of communication is critically important, because we have to remember these situations just don't affect kids, they just don't affect teachers, they affect parents as well. And so whatever that decision is made, parents have to be inclusive in the conversation. But even wider than that, this pandemic is causing a huge shift in the way that communities view how school is done. And we're having some very long needed conversations. And so whatever happens, those two groups have to be considered. It's great that we have plans for kids. It's great we have plans for teachers. We have to remember that these things also affect our parents and our community, so they have to be involved in those conversations as well.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to you for more on that, Stephen, as we go ahead in the panel. Moving on, thank you so much for that, panelists. Some very important points coming in terms of prioritization, in terms of keeping open channels of communication, and also continuous support for teachers, regardless of where in the world they might be. So on that note, Craig, since you're all the way across in Boston, over to you to take over and talk to us about what you've been doing at your school.
All right. So we're talking about equity, access, and opportunity. And we want schools and in our communities to really work with local, state, and national leaders, whether or not they are your faith-based institutions, your local businesses. You want to make sure that everyone is deeply involved in ensuring that our students have the best opportunity to thrive. And so we want to make sure that we're also considering, as Stephen was actually leaning us to think about not just the educational access, but also thinking about housing, employment, economic support for families and students that are also incredibly critical, at this time. And we want to make sure that we're also considering our vulnerable populations. One of the things that I think Dr. Advani may have talked about is just class stratification, and also being aware that not everyone has access to ensuring that every scholar they serve has their own device, or that you have families who may need food and shelter and other supports in order for them to also be able to fully actualize the dreams that they have for their young people. And so some of the things that we're doing here in the United States, and I've seen other countries do this as well, is really thinking about families' access to food pantries. Our school community actually has our own food pantry where we provide 2 really great meals for families, in addition to connecting our families to our EBT funds. We also have housing security measures in place. So right now, landlords cannot just evict the families out of a home if they're not able to pay their rent or mortgage, and there's some protections there. But we also talk about technology support. And in a moment, I'll talk about how important it is not just to make sure that our kids have access to Flipgrid and Kahoot and other measures, but how are we bringing families along, because they're also experiencing this challenge and, and stretching themselves to ensure that their kids have what they need. And we think about financial access, parent engagement, but one of the biggest and most critical areas for us as communities is to think about what's the legislative action that is taking place. So what are the bills that are in place to ensure that our families are going to be right-sized, and they're going to have an opportunity to best ensure that while they're trying to make sure their kids are fed, their kids are learning right there with their teachers, but we also want to make sure that there's access to employment opportunities, that there are some stopgap measures for those families who've really been struggling, and that with some of our educators, right, that also we're taking care of them, and what measures are in place to ensure that they are able to thrive. And so when I think about just what we've been able to do with the power of parent partnerships, we've had to ensure that our communication is in multiple languages. And we've been using a tool called Trade Tools, which is an opportunity to ensure that families have communications going back and forth in their own language. Parent education. So what kind of workshops are we providing? Not every family knew what Zoom was and how to use the Zoom features. So how are schools and districts communicating with parents about how to use Zoom or Kahoot or things like that? Because our parents are our children's first teachers. We don't want to leave them behind in this process. And so we want to make sure that we're providing all kinds of access to different ways that parents can work with their young people, especially their little ones, in order to ensure that their scholars are going to continue to thrive. We also, as schools, communities across the nation and globe, are really thinking about what are the supports that are available in the community that they can leverage. So for if we have families who are parents who are on the front lines, is there childcare support for them? We're thinking about some of our elderly parents, our elderly members who are also the parents to their young people. What are we doing to ensure that they actually have what they need? And so whether or not that's bringing meals to those who are elderly, those who are our grandparents, our young people, whether or not that is just social emotional learning supports. Some of our families are going through it, and they're also trying to figure out, how am I going to cope in this environment? And then relational trust. And I'm going to show you some highlights in a moment about how we're building and strengthening our relationships with parents, because the homeschool partnerships are incredibly, incredibly important here. And so I have a resource at the bottom, Global FRP, which is Global Family Resource Partnerships, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a great place to look at some different strategies you can use to support you as you're engaging with your families. So one of the things that we have at my school community is called Bridge Apron. And Bridge Apron is a really dynamic experience for families. We are afforded, we're a charter school, so we have the ability to support our families. Like almost 100% of our kids are kids who live with assistance, whether or not it's from state, local, federal means. And so we have a Bridge Apron so one time a week We put 2 sumptuous meals, all of the ingredients for those meals, a recipe guide, and we also have a Zoom call, Zoom class, food prep class, where our students and our families get to learn how to create really sumptuous and delicious meals. It's pretty amazing because it's one of the ways our school continues to partner with our families at home. We get to see our kids, and it's a very fun way to teach all kinds of things. You can teach math and cooking, the science of cooking. It's just pretty remarkable. When we're building relational trust, we also have really great through lines with our parents through Instagram, Facebook, where we continue the partnership even there. And so, as you can see, our teachers created this wonderful collage and sent out some love back to the families and students just to let them know, you know what, we miss you. And we know our parents are relying heavily on our teachers, who, I agree with Dr. Avani, are the world's biggest and best superheroes in the world. We also host virtual happy hours. So I know some of us may love a nice tea. Some of us might love, you know, a little Hennessy. But what we think about here is, how are we also creating spaces for parents to also say, hey, I'm struggling, or girl, do you understand, you know, what's going on, you know, as a parent who has little ones who are trying to learn in the background and they're running around, or how to use this. So we created a safe space where parents, every week, it's on a Thursday night, there's what we call a virtual happy hour. And our parents are able to engage with each other. It's directed with our director of family engagement. And it's just a really great time for families to just be able to connect, and it doesn't have to focus on teaching and learning. It just creates an opportunity for them to share about the experiences they're having and resources in the community. And as you all may be aware, here in the United States, we're dealing with a lot of racial injustice and infighting here. And so some of our families are actually directly afflicted by this. And so we have to be culturally responsive when we think about just what is it that our kids are experiencing with the racial injustice, the brutality that's being, you know, filmed, and how are we actually having those conversations with our kids? How are parents having conversations? And what are we able to do to really ensure that our families know, guess what? We are right here with you. We stand united with you because we understand how this may be creating a sense of emotion, anxiety, some fear. And we want our parents to know that we're standing with them, that we love them, and we're not going to actually have them be left behind in this. And so we're creating partnerships with our local law enforcement, faith-based leaders, mental health and behavioral health leaders, because we know how important that is. And so as we think ahead, we do realize, especially here in the United States, but I think globally, we know that our kids are going to come in and they're going to have, it might be an access gap. It might be an educational gap. It might actually be an opportunity gap. We know that this can have long-lasting effects on our young people and our families. And so what we're really trying to think about, and I know that Kirsten is going to speak to this in a moment, is really focusing on us receiving our young people right where they are when they arrive, and knowing that who they are, exactly where they are, is incredibly important. Knowing that when they come in, we're saying, you know what, I believe in you, I love you, I care about you, and we are going to help you to rise from where you are. And growth mindset is the key here. That's how we're going to actually transform culture. It's being able to say, hey, we're going to use all of our tools, all of our resources, all of our partnerships, all of our collaborations to let our young people and families know that we're not going to leave them left behind. And that's through growth mindset. So really starting with letting kids come in, and I do know there are some state agencies, some national entities that are going to say, hey, these are the benchmarks and standards that you have to live by. But if you're a teacher on the front lines and you are really concerned about, you know, having a kid come in who may have been on track, but actually is finding themselves further behind than they should be, you know, according to the benchmarks that we know, you just love them from where they are and let them know we're going to get you stronger and better. We're going to learn from the mistakes that you make, and it's okay, but you can do it. And then celebrate when kids have actually arrived and hit the mark. And that's definitely through growth mindset. And as I conclude my thinking here, I strongly believe that every scholar we serve deserves a high quality education. But it means that our families have to have access to equitable resources to create the quality of life in which they want their children. They have dreams and aspirations for their children too. But the only way that this actually works is when the school embraces our families and our scholars. And that's through consistent communication, providing access to academic, social, emotional, and community resources. And we maintain those trusting relationships with our scholars and families that they can depend on. And we're in times we've never been in before. No one has experienced a pandemic that has actually created such ripples in the way that we've educated our young people. But I strongly believe that regardless of the educational or access gaps, we have the ability to welcome and receive every scholar we serve and just allow them to grow. And growth mindset is the way that we actually do that. And so I'm most honored, and I thank you all for allowing me the space and time to actually share some thinking with you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Paula.
Thank you so much for that, Craig. Some absolutely fantastic ideas in there. I absolutely loved the one about the blended apron. That was so amazing. It's so great to think that parents and teachers and classmates can all come together and cook a meal together. What a fantastic idea at a time like this to bring people together. Great thought there. Just a couple of other questions that have come in. Craig, would you like to start with shedding some light on how you've been assessing students and what some strategies around that could be?
Yes. Well, part of this is actually what at least what we're learning is having the parent and the student right there with you and setting some one-to-one FaceTime so that the teacher can show their scholars and their parents, like, here's what a kid's supposed to be doing. And so you can show, like, here's a book, and have that kid read, and then you talk about what are the moves that kid needs to do in order to, or how to read. And you can do that diagnostic with families so they know what to look for. Because what we're realizing, is when the teacher is teaching the parent is also learning how that kid should be actually reading and doing mathematics and things like that. So I do realize some parents are working, so that makes it a little tougher. But even if you did a video of this is the reading level, this is the math moves. And so when we are actually going into classes today or next week, here's some things you should be expecting. And even if a teacher did a 5-minute screencastify of like the type of assessment they're doing, through even for our scholars who have learning challenges, they'll have access to what that assessment could be like, and also parents can work with them. So we're learning that we're utilizing a lot of video, we're using a lot of teachers teaching parents, and they're also showing them some of the assessments so that parents can also do their part at home. So we've seen some success, but we have some challenges with some families who are not even coming and accessing the learning.
Well, following up from what Craig said, we found we did virtual parent-teacher meetings, and the teachers reported two things. One is that they were much better attended when they were online. And the other is that the teacher found it much simpler to explain exactly what is required to the student and the parent by being able to put up the work and focus on that. Another thing is where students run personal conferences with the teacher about this is what I can do. Overall, I think in part of the planning that the teacher does and must share with the students, it's important to make that assessment that will come at the end of the learning very, very visible, a sort of backward design model, to be able to say that all students, or this is what you must be able to do. And then as students work through their learning, they really are able to come up with meeting the assessment objectives more clearly.
Absolutely. So a lot of backward design when it comes to assessments, specifically also a focus on formative assessments more at this point in time, like you were talking about in your presentation as well. When we're talking more about end term or summative assessments, that these might also be great times to experiment with projects and project-based learning and projects turning into assessments that are actually mapping student growth over a certain period of time, because we do have a lot of opportunity right now for kids to be working at their own time at home and then turn that into active, constructive time spent towards a particular project. So great thoughts there as well. Now, Stephen, over to you to talk us through some of the important things you were talking about in terms of community and so on. Stephen, sir, you're
awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to get my chat back up here so I could see. I'm going to put my contact information there in the chat, so I hope that we can stay connected. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to have this time to talk to you. This whole notion of what school is going to look like next year is something that I've been talking to a lot of school districts around the world about as part of the work that I do with many districts and many schools around the globe. A lot of my work centers on looking at research and thinking about how research-based instruction can influence the way, no matter what school looks like next year, how we can move forward, regardless of if there is a pandemic in place or not. And so, one of the things that research tells us is that teachers who are reflective, their students do better. And so what I have is, and what I want to take just a few minutes to talk about is a story in 3 parts, and thinking about, we can be reflective on the previous school year and thinking about, okay, when we had this move and we had this shift to remote learning, what did I do? And then moving forward, what can I do better? And so we're going to look at these 3 aspects, which I think are pivotal to having success, regardless of what school looks like, and that's community, social emotional well-being, and ultimately teaching and learning. So with community, when we look at the classroom community, the teachers who reported that they had successful transitions to remote learning were the ones who said that they spent a great deal of time getting to know their students. I tell the stories a lot about my own children because I'm very lucky to have the teachers that I did this year, because they spent an incredible amount of time at the beginning of the school year before any of this happened, building those relationships and communities with their students. And that ultimately paid off when they had to go remote. And where I live in North Carolina in the United States, my students, my kids and our students in our school district were in school on March the 12th, and then March the 13th forward, they were not in school. It was that sudden of a transition. And those students who had a clear connection to their teacher and who had a clear connection to the other students in their classrooms ultimately did better. And I'm hearing this from many teachers around the globe. And so some questions to think about is, how was your classroom community prepared? Not just with technology. And believe me, I've been an advocate for technology for 15 years. Even in my own classroom, I was utilizing technology and saw the impact that it had. But certainly, were there conversations about how to continue and maintain those relationships through technology? How did we maintain that sense of community when we were forced to be separate? With many parents I talked to, and many teachers too, one of the biggest things that teachers did who reported success was that they called their students. Now, again, I know there are equity issues and there are challenges with scheduling and things, but what this move to remote learning and forced separation has done is allowed us to have non-traditional times of school where typically we would be isolated, like here in the US between that 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. But now teachers could extend those days out and call those students later in the day or when it was more convenient, and simply having that voice-to-voice contact with those students every day or every other day made a tremendous difference. And then thinking too, intrinsically, what did I learn about community? So then moving forward, what are some things you're going to do next year that you learned, perhaps that worked well, that didn't work well? What are those things that you're going to do moving forward to help build those relationships? And then specifically, like Craig mentioned, in the United States, it's a very tumultuous time, but it's also a very a time for us to be thinking and moving forward in terms of social action and shining a light on social justice. So what role can that play in our communities next year? Community, again, is one of the most important things we can do in the classroom, and all around the globe. It's not just in the United States. If we look at many communities around the globe, the students and teachers are hurting, not just because of the pandemic and not just because of forced isolation, but because of actual and realistic social injustices that are happening in their countries. And so these are the same types of injustices that have plagued communities and school systems since schooling began. And so we have to take that into consideration and not shy away from having those conversations, and not shying away from bringing that into the classroom to have honest discussions about it, but also using the classroom as a place to push those ideas of positive change forward. Kids need those spaces to be able to talk about those events, but they also need to know that the adults in their lives are fighting for them, that they care about them. And so, regardless of what school looks like, all of these things can benefit us. If we go back to school and then suddenly, the pandemic rages again, having that community in place is going to be critically important. As many have already mentioned, social emotional health and mental health are absolutely critical during this time. We might think that having, being able to stay at home. I know for me, I travel 300 days a year, and I haven't been on an airplane since March the 17th. And so, we might be thinking it might be nice to be at home and not have to worry about going out and doing those things. But especially for students, they like to be connected. They love being with their friends. They like having those opportunities to go to school. And again, I know I tell a lot of stories about my own children, but my daughters were devastated when they couldn't go to school anymore. And so that can cause a real strain on their social, emotional, and mental well-being. And so let's think back to the previous, to the last 3 months, or even the last school year. What did we do to ensure that students' social emotional well-being was taken care of? How did we utilize tools to help students understand their social emotional growth? More importantly, their mental health. Finally, the pandemic is shining a spotlight on students' mental health and ensuring that students are mentally well. But what did we do during this time to ensure that? Did we reach out? Did we call? What strategies did we utilize? But not only that, as we were just talking about, parents, for many of our parents, not only now did we ask them to have to stay home and work from home, which for many is a completely new experience, we're asking them to step into the role of being a teacher for their own students. And which can cause a great emotional strain on adults. And as adults, we might think that we're well equipped to handle stress, better than our students. But certainly, I saw it every day in parents that I talked to, that they found it just emotionally draining. So what can we do as educators and education communities to ensure that our parents are okay? And then, most importantly, none of this matters if you're not well. And so what are some of the things that you did? It's really awesome that we have a lot of all-star teachers. Every teacher in our profession is an all-star because of the work that they do. But you can only have so much mental energy during these situations to do your absolute best. So what did you do to take care of yourself during this time? And then looking forward, utilizing those communities, how can you make those students feel safe in their classroom? Because ultimately with social, emotional, mental health, if we're going to have these conversations about social injustice, and we're going to have these conversations about forced isolation, and or if we're going to go to school and kids can't hug each other, they can't hug their teacher, how are we going to make sure that they're safe spaces and focusing on their mental health? What awareness can you raise with your staff to make sure that the wider community is mentally well? And then how can you ensure that you yourself are mentally well? I'm all for teaching content. I think content is important. I think in some cases, the way that we approach teaching content is very out of date and needs a complete overhaul. And fortunately, we're in a time where we can do that. But if we exclusively focus on content, all we're doing is building compliant, non-thinking adults. We need students to be able to empathize with others. We need students to be able to empathize with themselves, or consider the challenges that other groups of people face in our communities. It's so pivotally important that we spend more time focused on the social emotional well-being of our students, but ultimately their mental health as well. Because if we don't have students who are mentally well, we have students who can't learn. So regardless of what school looks like next year, that near constant consideration needs to be the social, emotional, and mental well-being of everyone in our school community, not just our students, not just our teachers, but those staff members as well who are impacted. Our hero staff members, our janitorial staff, who if students are at school are going to have to work harder than they normally do, our food service staff, our transportation staff, all of those folks must be involved in the conversations as well. And then we need to make sure that we're mentally well. And then lastly, teaching and learning. You might think, well, Stephen, isn't teaching and learning the most important thing? Certainly, that teaching and learning is important, and we need to be thinking about, well, what did we do? I've been working with schools and districts around the world with utilizing technology and teaching and learning for almost 15 years now, and it still amazes me that we have to have conversations about how to teach in online environments when those conversations have been had for many, many, many years. But certainly there was a great deal of unpreparedness with this sudden move. So even though we were all stars, what did we do to ensure that our students were learning? How did we know? And formative assessment is certainly the way to do it. Formatively assessing multiple times every day. What strategies did you use that worked well? What didn't work so well? And then can you step back and say, right now, my students are prepared for next year? If they're not, there's no blame to be had, but utilizing that understanding of, what, my students going into next year are prepared as well as they could be, but here's what I want to do better next year, is certainly a reflection activity to undertake. And then moving into next year, our school year, regardless of what happens, is going to be drastically and radically different than it was this year, than it was in previous years, simply because of the way that school was undertaken in spring of 2020. So how are you, when these new students come in, going to determine where they are in their understanding? What tools and methods are you going to use to make sure that students are where they need to be? But then what are you going to use to meet the need of every student? Because it's not just students like my own who have full access. It's what are we doing to ensure our special education students are taken care of, our academically gifted students, each one of these different population students who don't speak the language. How are we going to ensure that we're going to meet the needs of all of those students where, if differentiation wasn't the norm in the classroom, it certainly needs to be the norm in the remote learning. So I'll leave you with this, that we're at this crossroads in education right now where, we talk a lot, especially in the US, we talk a lot about how we need to radically transform the system, about how the current, traditional means of schooling needs to be destroyed, and we need to rebuild it from the ground up. Well, here we are. We're at this pivotal moment where we need to, where we can change the system. So we have two choices. We can go down the traditional path where inequality and injustices since schooling began are still the norm, or we can put more of an emphasis on empathizing with others, where we can create authentically, where differentiation is the norm. where we talk about 21st century learning, we can finally have a system in place where learning looks like it should in the 21st century. So thanks to everybody for joining me. I'll put my contact information back in the chat, and look forward to everybody's questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Stephen. Some very, very important points in there. The last one particularly ringing true about how we are at a crossroads. And this is a very, very important point in time where we might want to reconsider how we've been approaching teaching and learning all these years, and perhaps ditch some of the stuff that hasn't worked, and think about newer ways in which we can engage our students, and help them learn better and help them become more resilient and active citizens in the world today, which is really the need of the hour. So on that note, I'm quickly going to jump over to Kirsten because I know that we're running short on time, and then we'll try and come back for more questions towards the end. So Kirsten, very quickly over to you.
Okay, let me just share the screen. Excuse me. Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being with us here tonight. I'm going to pretty much follow on from where Craig, left off, because I too think that we're in a crossroads right now. And I want to just bring the focus in on learning. All of what have been said, I completely and utterly agree with. If we don't have relationships, we don't have anything. If we don't deal with the affective nature of learning by making our students feel comfortable and all of these things, then we really cannot move forward. Oh, sorry, I need to get this up on here. There we go, now we are. All right, so I'm just gonna pick up with also something that Craig mentioned about growing learners, but I want us just to press pause, okay, and take a deep breath, because this work is not going to be easy. Our work as teachers is never easy, but this work is not going to be easy. We're going to have to be brave, and we're going to have to dig deep into our deepest resources, and we're going to have an extremely flexible mindset when we say, what can we do with the time and the resources that we have in front of us, which will be different for every single person listening, to meet the needs and pull out what lies within our students, which again will be different for every single student in our care. So when we think of this idea of assessment, I want to flip it, and I want to bring the idea of evidencing learning. When we come back to school, every year when we come back to school, we need to find out where our learners are at. But very often, we don't really do anything with that information other than just saying, oh, look, they can't do this, but now we need to teach that because it's a new year. So I'm asking not just teachers, but school leaders and state boards to consider, what does this mean when we get assessment and then we say we're going to go ahead and teach what the year says anyway? So I want to bring in the idea of learning continuums, which is my original training in Scotland. And if you're interested on looking at a couple, I have a couple of examples linked here for you. And if you want to get onto something really brilliant and really up and coming, which is a conceptual continuum on a continuum basis of learning that can really attend to core competencies, that can really attend to strong academic learning, then do investigate the Common Ground Collaborative, because they're very inexpensive and extremely high quality. But continuums. Continuums, for me, are the absolute underpinning power of my teaching. Because when I think about a learning continuum, it empowers me to know where every child is and what the next steps in learning are for that child. It empowers me to maximize my instructional time with groups and individual children. It empowers the children to make most of their time, because those ones that I know that they can already do something, I can set them up an investigation challenge. I can set them up an extension problem. But for those ones that are struggling and haven't got there yet, I can sit down or I can do more modeling with them. If we look at a continuum basis of learning, we're looking for evidence of growth. We're not looking for evidence of failure. And they give very, very strong discussions at parent-teacher conferences. So very simple proposition, okay? If we look at the traditional standards-based or benchmark-based or objectives-based, they say, okay, here's our grade 4, and the children need to be able to do this. So while we have these children, they can only do this down here. So they're behind. They're behind. I feel very strongly that children cannot be behind their own stage of learning. I just want that to sink in. How can a child be behind their own stage of learning? These statements have been made, yes, to give us a ballpark. But the kids that are in those classes, they've come from all different backgrounds, they're different ages, they've had different experiences, and yet we want to measure them all by the same token. If I use a continuum, if I very simply keep the same statements but take the labels off, instead of saying that child should be here and he's only here, I'm saying that child is here, what does he or she need to do next? I'm not looking here because I know that child is not ready yet. I know that I have to keep them moving up the continuum. So that's something that I really want people to think about, whether it's possible. If we could, especially now with the spread of learners that we have coming towards us, if we could stop thinking about children being behind and start thinking about where are they and what growth steps do we need them to make along the continuum of learning? How could this be useful in them setting individual goals, moving forward with individual goals, involving all our community in supporting them with their individual learning goals? Okay, the second thing that I want to bring up is what is actually worth learning. That's something that Stephen definitely touched on, okay? It is significant that a lot of what we're teaching at the moment is absolutely not effective use of our students' time. And can we be brave and use this point in time and stand up and say, what is actually useful? I saw somebody asked a question in the chat. They said, can teachers add something new? Somebody else was talking about the overloaded primary curriculum, okay? If we really drill down to what is absolutely necessary, this can be a very, very releasing thing. So there's two aspects that I believe are really, really important when we're thinking about what is worth learning. And the first is core competencies, okay? You can find all different sets of core competencies, but a very popular one are the 21st century skills. If we recalibrate our learning around the development of the skills that the children are actually going to need in their lives to be successful human beings, to be successful in the workplace, to be successful in leading their own businesses, that is a lot more useful for them than learning a whole sequence of facts about history and memorizing periodic tables. Is that information useful? Absolutely. But why does it need to be memorized? Why can it not be there, just information that's given that we interact with and say, how can we use this to form the basis of an argument? Or how can we use this to prove something that we're curious about? So just trying to flip our thinking about, we're using our content as context to develop competencies and character, rather than making it all about the content. So that can also soften the assessment, because we don't need to look at assessing content, we need to assess how are we interacting with it, what kind of ideas, what kind of skills are we pushing forward. And what I've done here for you is I've just linked in some resources if you want to explore some of those ideas further. They have very, very practical strategies on all of these sites for you. Moving forward. Well, move forward. There we go. All right. The second part of what's worth learning is complexity. And that is this idea of big ideas around the world. If you embrace conceptual learning, rather than saying we're going to learn about the French Revolution, or we're going to learn about the Indus civilization, we're going to learn about conflict. Causes of conflict, effects of conflict. I can bring literature into that. I can bring geography into that. I can bring science into that. I can bring history into that. I can look at how civilizations are structured. Big ideas, and contextualize them in ways that engage children in solving problems, creating and designing. When we do our civilizations unit, the children look at modern day civilization and what technologies have developed, and then they create their own civilization and design their own technology is extremely, extremely powerful. And they're able to do that very, very easily online. In fact, my grade 1 students, they probably had their most successful unit through online learning because they were designing and creating buildings. So we think about effective teaching and learning. And we're thinking about setting up our remote learning or our blended learning or our flipped learning. You might have kids coming in for 2 days a week, have Wednesday as a cleaning and planning day, and the next set of kids coming in for 2 days a week. So you might have 2 days in school, 3 days follow-up. While you're in school, you'll be setting up provocations, invitations to learning, modeling. You'll be going through misconceptions. You'll be providing feedback on prior learning. You'll be conferencing with students to set their learning goals and supporting them in the choices that they might make. And the days that they're away from you, they will be doing all of these things, exploring their theory, designing and creating, providing the evidence of learning. Stop thinking about making assessments and start looking for evidence of learning. Okay, so if we think about our design, we say, what are the desired results? What is it we want to come out of this? What is the evidence that we want? And then we plan our learning experiences and instructional strategies to get that evidence to come out. We can ask the kids to show us the evidence. If they understand where the learning is going, they will bring us the evidence themselves. I promise you, the very youngest children can do this. Okay, so just to finish very quickly, the goal here is to keep all brains engaged. And I know that there are many concerns about differently abled learners, EAL learners, and that you do need very specialist support on that. But if we can think about developing a child from where they are to going forward and stop thinking about them as being failing because they're not meeting a set prescribed necessity for a year group, we can zoom in more on raising them competently. And if we focus on conceptual learning, concepts transfer. You can access a concept at multiple levels in the way that you cannot necessarily interact with content at multiple levels. Okay, and if we're looking for evidencing learning virtually, for those of you who are looking, I know a lot of people use this already, but Seesaw, somebody mentioned what is the best app for assessing online for early learners. Seesaw, hands down, 100%. You can give feedback, they can do orally, there's so much that, just get on it, explore it, it's free. Okay, here are some strategies you might like to explore, and here are some other resources that you might like to explore. So I just want to end by saying, oh no, one more thing before I end. Okay, just some more things that you might like to explore, okay? Conceptual learning, a big idea about the world, the way in which we do it, very, very passionate about inquiry learning, project-based learning. Here are some resources if you want to explore them. I'm going to be bold and put it out there. If any school wants to contact me, I'm very happy to give you an hour with your staff and take them through one of these resources and explain how they might be used, okay? You can contact me on Twitter. I can help you. That's bringing us back to the idea that PD is very important. There's a lot of PD online at the moment, but not everybody knows where it is. So in our group, we're trying really hard to bring that all together. So just to finish, okay, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. None of this is going to be easy. And the only way we're going to get through it is by being flexible mindset, by saying, what resources do we have? How can we think about using them in different ways? What new ideas are we able to build in that are safe for us? And how can we make the most of the people that we have? And then how can we stop putting pressure on ourselves and our students to do the impossible? Because we can only do as much as we can do with the resources that we have to hand. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsten. Some absolutely fantastic tool recommendations, resources, and your magnanimity. It's fabulous to know, really to have observed how many educators have opened up their learning resources, their time, and their hearts as well to educators around the world in these last 2.5, 3 months that we've been bracing, and embracing this lockdown globally, as well as adapting to all these challenges that schools are now facing the world over. So thank you on that note to all the panelists for sharing all their knowledge and for their wisdom, as well as for showing us the path ahead, some very, very pointed ways forward for schools as we reopen, some important and powerful ideas to think about as we go home, and also to perhaps reimagine the way in which we've been approaching education and learning in our classrooms all these years. And some things about how some new things that we've learned in the last couple of months that we might like to continue working on as we reopen schools. So thank you, Dr. Advani, Craig, Stephen, and Kirsten for your time today. Thank you to all the wonderful participants who showed up and for all those fantastic questions. We know we've not been able to answer every question, but feel free to keep posting your question on Highr's social media groups. You can also individually send across your questions to each of our panelists, and you can reach out to them, and whatever has been left unanswered, we'll try and reach out to all of you and address these queries nonetheless. We look forward to seeing you at our next session on Friday, which will be looking at how we can go about doing some reflective planning. So thank you so much for having tuned in, everyone, today. Thank you, panelists, once again. Goodbye and have a wonderful evening ahead.